How comes it that humans make their greatest exertions not for their own gain, family, or lives, but for an idea, a moral conception of who I am and who we are? And this is the privilege of absurdity to which no creature but man is subject, of which Thomas Hobbes wrote in Leviathan. In the middle of the last century, André Malraux, the great French cultural polymath, said the next century has to be religious or it will not be. There was a great clash of secular ideologies that almost led to the destruction of the world. Both, in the end, he felt were soulless. One has won. But in this globalized competition among individuals for dominance, you can still hear me, there seems to be left out a sense of community, a sense of enchantment, a sense of spirituality. And the dark side of globalization is rearing its head, both in terrorist movements and in populist political movements, very much in the similar ways of what happened with the collapse of the long relative peace in Europe between the Congress of Vienna after the Napoleonic Wars and the beginning of World War I, when the whole international system began unraveling quite rapidly with the rise of the anarchist movement, which has many parallels to the jihadi movement today, and to the collapse of the international order as countries began breaking the rules as they are doing now. So our team of academics, policymakers, and former military, playwrights, and poets explore why people refuse political compromise, go to war, attempt revolution, or resort to terrorism, focusing on what Darwin called those virtues highly esteemed and even sacred that give immense advantage to any group inspired by devoted individuals willing to sacrifice for them. This is our team on the front lines near Mosul recently, where we were talking about willingness to fight. President Obama in 2004 said the biggest mistake we made was underestimating the will to fight among the Islamic State and overestimating the will to fight among the Iraqi army. So what we did was we went to the front and we interviewed everyone from ISIS to Al-Qaeda in Syria to the Peshmerga, the PKK, the IPG, the Iraqi army, the Sunni and Shia militia, to try to find out what is behind will to fight. Who is willing to sacrifice, fight, and die, and for why? A little bit of background on religion and war generally. Only about 7% of wars throughout human history and recorded history have been religiously motivated. But when religion becomes involved in wars, they tend to become intractable and last a very long time. Religion, of course, is also responsible for some of the great advances in human rights. The civil rights movement in the United States was fundamentally a religious movement in the Baptist churches of the United States. Now, our studies suggest that costly and seemingly arbitrary ritual commitment to logically and empirically inscrutable beliefs, because religious beliefs are empirically and logically inscrutable, it deepens trust, galvanizing group solidarity for common defense and blinding members to exit strategy. By contrast, reasoned social contracts, which are matters of convenience, secular contracts, do not tend to last more than 3 generations. Why? Because if it's merely a contract of convenience, there's always a better deal down the line. And if there's always a better deal down the line, it's better to defect now rather than later. So they're inherently unstable in the long run. Now, across cultures, primary group identity is bounded by sacred values, often in the form of beliefs or transcendental ideologies, which lead some groups to triumph over others. And sacred values can be secular or religious, as when land or law becomes holy or hallowed. Well, our frontline studies of combatants across the world leads us to believe that intractable conflict and unconditional cooperation are better understood within a devoted actor framework rather than a rational actor framework. And the devoted actor framework is characterized by 2 sort of research paradigms. One is sacred values, which I've just talked about, and the other is something called identity fusion. Consider these circles. Self, that's the little circle, and the group is the big circle. So we present this on the front lines, and we ask people, where do you put yourself? Those who go to E, the last one, who see themselves completely within the last circle, have one and only one reference group. Many of us have many identities. our favorite football teams, our occupations, our religion, our country. But when you fuse in that last group, you behave differently than any other group. You think of yourselves invincible. You psych one another up, and everyone is willing to sacrifice for the other. When these two things come together, then you have maximum willingness to fight, die, torture, kill, and suffer even the loss of your family. For sacred values, we find people are unwilling to make trade-offs or compromises, no matter how much money is offered, no matter what material assets are offered. In fact, the contrary occurs. When Palestinians, where only 6% of Palestinians would actually, of refugees, would actually choose to go back to Israel if having the choice, well over 90% of Palestinians would not accept to give up the right of return, even though they'd never go back. And when you offer money, then their support for things like suicide bombing and violence even increases. The same is true for Israeli settlers. The same was true for the Iranian nuclear program. The same is true for Americans who are devoted to the right to life or to gun rights. What do I mean by sacred values? Well, economic decision-making has been the subject of politics and many disciplines, and we know most of the axioms and utility theories, but we know very little about sacred values and how they function. What does appear to function is that they act in ways completely different from standard economic and political decision-making. And I'll just talk about a few of them. One is immunity to trade-offs. What does that mean? Most of us would not sacrifice our children, our countries, or our religion for all the money in China. They are not fungible. They're insensitive to temporal and spatial discounting. In economic and political theory, those events and items that are closer to you in the here and now are more important than those in the future or the distant past. For sacred values, the opposite can be true. Those events and things in the distant past or future may be much more valuable. They blind us to exit strategies. No matter how reasonable or rewarding, people will not abandon those values. And they generate actions independent of prospects of success, of risks and rewards, of costs and consequences, because they are perceived to be the right thing to do. Now, we do brain scans of sacred values, for good or ill, most recently among supporters of the Al-Qaeda affiliate Lashkar-Taiba in Pakistan, where we find that people willing to die for sacred values show much less deliberative reasoning in those parts of the brain associated with utilitarian reasoning in favor of rapid, duty-bound responses. Now, why do we do brain scans? One, because brain scans you can't lie about. So it shows that these beliefs in sacred values are not quasi-beliefs, they're not pseudo-beliefs, they're not pretending, and they're not posturing. They're real. Secondly, because we can find things in the brain that we didn't know behaviorally. For example, centers for revenge in the brain and centers for joy and happiness in the brain are exactly the same centers. So we know the feelings of revenge and the feeling of joy happen to be the same. And we do, as I said, this with Al-Qaeda, we do it with Islamic State, and we do it with Peshmerga or PKK. These are just experiments we did recently on the Mosul front, and what we find is that people consider, this is just an iPad where you can make the body bigger or smaller and more muscular or less muscular, that people on all sides, whether it be Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State or the PKK or the Peshmerga or the Iraqi army, rate the United States with maximum force, spiritually middling force, the Islamic State with almost no physical force. In fact, the Belgian army could defeat it if it was just manpower, but spiritually maximum force. And all on the front believe that spiritual trumps material force when all things are equal. In fact, since World War II, insurgent and revolutionary groups have beaten standard police and armies with up to 10 times more firepower and manpower, for the simple reason that standard police and armies operate on the basis of material risks and rewards like pay and punishment and promotion, but these people operate on belief. And let me go through this really fast. The Islamic State revolution is a classic revolution. Just calling it terrorism, I think, is delusional. Think of what Robespierre said for the French Revolution. Terror is an emergency measure emanating from virtue. For without a claim to moral virtue, it is inconceivable to want to kill masses of people innocent of doing direct harm to others. And in this sense, it follows the trajectory of a classic revolution. At first, it's founded by leaders who are mostly well-educated, often in the sciences. Then it appeals to masses of marginalized people. And finally, state building, where women are very important. And now we have 1 out of every 3 coming from France are women because the state needs it. So it's the conflict dynamics, not the personalities, that are driving the Islamic State. And think about the Islamic State. What are they telling you? They're telling you, come here to be sleep deprived. Come here to suffer. Come here to sacrifice. People who think that giving them jobs or giving them women is going to buy them off, I think are also somewhat delusional. It's not about brainwashing. Brainwashing is a fiction from the Korean War, when 100 Brits and Americans didn't want to come back to America and Britain. So this fiction, the Manchurian Candidate, was invented where these Chinese social engineering wizards using Pavlovian techniques washed the brains of these Americans and Brit. Never happened. And nihilism, the Islamic State argues the contrary. When I talk to young women who join the Islamic State, they tell me, I joined because I want a woman to be a woman. I want a man to be a man. In my culture, I don't know what's what. I can't talk to my parents in Arabic because they won't want to talk to me. And I'm viewed for suspicion from everybody in my society. So I will go there to look for dignity. I got a call from the head of a medical school in Khartoum. The entire straight A class went to Raqqa to found a clinic. So it's not just criminals, it's not just marginals, it's people actually looking good. And I talked to a former imam who's now joined Al-Qaeda because he felt that the killing of guests was wrong. And he said to me, the young who came to us were not to be lectured like witless children. They are for the most part understanding and compassionate, but misguided. We have to give them a better message, but a positive one to compete. Otherwise, they'll be lost to Daesh. How comes it that the values of open societies and democracy increasingly appear to be losing ground to the narrow nationalisms and radical religious fundamentalism in a tacit alliance that's sundering Europe's middle class and much else in the world in ways similar to the hatchet job that the communists and the fascists did in the 1920s and 1930s? Here's one of my favorite authors, and particularly a posit for today's world, George Orwell. Go on the internet, there's a one-page review of Mein Kampf, written in 1940 by Orwell. And Orwell asks, how is it that socialist countries, and to a more grudging extent, capitalist countries, offer their people ease, avoidance of risk and pain, hygiene, health care, birth control, in short, the good life? And no one here is willing to fight for the values of freedom and democracy. The Oxford Student Union at the time had just voted never again to fight for anything. And Mr. Hitler, what is he offering his people? Power, glory, revolution, death, destruction of the old world to build a new world. And 80 million people fall down at his feet. Why? Because Mr. Hitler understands something profound about human nature. Human beings need, at least intermittently, a sense of self-sacrifice and transcendence. Now I ask you, what dreams may come from current government policies that offer little beyond grudging promises of comfort and security? People are willing to sacrifice everything, including their lives, the totality of their interests, will not be lured away by material incentives or disincentives. The science suggests that sacred values are best opposed with other sacred values. But I heard Mr. Schwab when I was at Davos 2 weeks ago saying, one of the most important things we have to do is be willing to sacrifice for the common good. But I ask you, what is the common good people are willing to sacrifice today? Where is it? No one seems to know. So how can we combat this sort of violent extremism? And also, I think, a crisis in our civilization. For civilizations rise and fall on cultural ideas, not material assets alone. And we find that most people in most societies have sacred values for which they're willing to sacrifice everything. But we don't find that among Western youth today. And we don't find it about masses of youth in the Middle East or in Asia. It's something that ISIS is offering, however misguided. It's something that the populist movements, the populist wave across Europe is offering, however misguided. Well, I'm just going to talk briefly about three very, very local success stories. I'll go through this. It's all about counter-engagement. It's meeting the needs, the narratives, and the networks, as Ari talked about, but not in the abstract. Talking about ideology or narratives as free-floating ideas out there, I think, is a waste of time. They are embedded in particular minds, in particular social networks. If we look at the recruitment pattern for Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, if it were just social media and personal recruitment, it would be randomized recruitment and a dispersed recruitment pattern. We find clustered in towns, particular cities, particular neighborhoods, and 3 out of every 4 people who join it with their friends or family or fellow travelers. So the best predictor of who joins any of this movement is if your friend joined this particular movement, not if some recruiter talked to you, and not if you heard it over social media. So how do we engage these people? Well, in Pakistan, 2 teenagers, Saba and Gulalai Ismail, in northwest Pakistan, developed a women's advocacy group to bring the young men away from violence, the Taliban. And they brought 50 away, and those 50 brought another 50, and they brought 1,500 away. Now they have over 10,000 young men who would have gone to violence that these young women have brought away. Another one is Amina Hoti in Pakistan, and she uses the story of Shah Jahan, the builder of the Taj Mahal, and his 2 sons, Darashiko and what was his name? Aurangzeb. One was a scholar like his father and a religious pluralist. The other was militarily capable and a deep conservative who killed his brother and imprisoned his father. And she has the students act this out all over the country in theater. They discuss what had happened. They decide for themselves how they would have permitted, how they would have allowed, or how they even would have mobilized militarily to allow Darashiko to win out over his more militant brother. And there are many such local success stories. But here's the problem. How do we get these local success stories to link up into a global success story the way ISIS does? ISIS will spend hundreds, even thousands of hours talking to a single person and say to a young woman in Seattle, I know how hard it is for you to leave your family. But there's something greater in life than just honoring your parents. Come and let us understand. We have to be able to engage like that, but on a global scale. And I will end with this. It has to be a transcendent message and meaning that gives individual existence significance beyond death, that binds people together beyond perceived interest, and creates enduring, peaceful, and progress towards the good. It has to be something. Will it be commitment to dollars, or riyals, or yuan, or to something greater? Thank you.